and a very warm welcome to you all, and thank you for joining us for our first webinar for 2025. And of course, we look forward to some wonderful input. Tonight, we honour the memory and reflect on the legacy of the late Gustavo Gutierrez, Dominican priest, pioneer of liberation theology, and long-time YCS chaplain. Gustavo was born in Peru in 1928 and passed away on the 22nd of October 2024 at the age of 96. His classic book, A Theology of Liberation, published in 1971, and his subsequent teaching and writing has had a huge impact on Catholic thought and continues to do so today. Now, as we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Darug people, of the traditional owners of the land where I'm located, and I would also want to acknowledge the custodians of the many First Nations land from which our group is drawn tonight. I pay my respects to elders, past and present, and I extend that respect to all First Nations people in our meeting today. So let us pray. Loving God, source of life, sustainer and sanctifier, you have brought us into being and ordained our place in the human family. You call us to live as sisters and brothers, to be responsible for each other and to care for one another. We give thanks for the lives of our brothers and sisters who have worked alongside us to build your kingdom on earth. As we gather and share, may we be mindful of the many in our world who are denied the things that we take for granted, and those who are excluded from the opportunities that we consider as our rights. May our gathering tonight be a moment of awareness which builds to lives of solidarity with all people, and especially with the most vulnerable in our human family. Amen. We are privileged to have three panel members who will speak to us tonight, sharing some reflections of their on the life and work of Gustavo Gutierrez. I'll introduce those three speakers and they'll each have their 15 minutes or so to speak to us. And of course, we would then welcome your comments and your questions in a little bit of an open forum towards the end. So our first panel member is Angela Carroll, and Angela is a sister of St. Joseph, who joined the congregation in 1959 after a couple of years in YCS in the secondary schools. A copy of the Theology of Liberation, which she received in 1975, changed her life in a wonderful way. She joined the Josephite mission in Lima in 1984, and in the course of that work, she saw and heard Gustavo speak many times during the popular summer theology courses. In Peru, she worked on the development of a catechetics program for families that were translated into the local language. The program worked on developing the relationship between husband and wife, as well as between parents and children. It also empowers women to have a voice at home when they are threatened by machismo and the effects of alcohol. In her work, Angela also established a flourishing craft micro-business in a village close to her area in Peru. Our second panel member is Jorge Jorquera, and Jorge arrived in Australia with his family as exiles from Chile about 40 years ago. An activist since his student days, he was elected secretary of the University of Queensland Student Union and coordinator of the National Free Education Coalition, which led the national campaign against the reintroduction of university fees. During the 1990s, he helped establish one of the first branches of the Green Party in New South Wales. Now living in Footscray in Melbourne's west, Jorge has been involved in community advocacy and development and social and environmental justice campaigning for over 4 decades. He has served as a councillor of the city of Maribyrnong from 2020 to 2024. He characterises himself as a socialist, a unionist, an anti-racist, and an advocate for migrant communities, working class families, and young people. Jorge is the coordinator of the Borderlands Cooperative in Melbourne. Our third panel member is Michael Elphick, and Michael has had a long career in interest in human rights, theology, and religious education. He spent the first half of his career as a high school teacher and administrator before joining the Edmund Rice Centre as a community educator, where he took responsibility for the centre's overseas immersion program. In this role, Michael led numerous study visits to India and Southeast Asia and participated in human rights delegations to Africa, Palestine, and Central America. Michael later taught as an adjunct lecturer in the School of Religious Education at Notre Dame University, Fremantle and Sydney, as well as Arcadia University in their Sydney program. Michael completed 2 Boston College summer schools under Gustavo Gutierrez in 1997 and 2006. The experiences continue to influence his political and theological outlook. He now works in safeguarding and professional standards as the Professional Standards Officer for the Missionary Society of St. Columba's in Oceania and the Safeguarding Support Officer for the Scalabridian Province of St. Francis Xavier Cabrini Province. So we welcome our 3 presenters, and in a moment I will ask Angela to kick us off with her reflection. And while Angela's getting her microphone ready so that she can speak to us, I just wanted to remind you, if you could please keep your microphone muted during the presentations of our speakers. We will have the opportunity for questions and contributions at the end. If you would like to add a question, you can do so by putting the question in the chat. You can also, at the appropriate time, use the raise hands function in Zoom, or if neither of those are familiar to you, you can just unmute yourself and shout at us, and I'm sure we would welcome your question. So without further ado, we're going to invite Angela to speak with us for a short while, and I'm going to ask Angela as a question for her reflection what it was like as a religious sister to be present among the poor of Peru at that time as Gustavo's work and the theologies of liberation were emerging.
Right. I've said that I got Gustavo's book in 1975, and we're into sort of anniversaries now. It was 10 years after that I actually heard my first lecture from Gustavo, and another 10 years before I met him in the airport in Cusco. But he left his footprints everywhere, like the Columbans themselves. Just wanted to read this. When our sisters first went to Peru, they were 4 of them. I wasn't with them. They stayed with the Columban sisters, and the Easter Vigil, this was one experience. They arrived at the church for the Easter ceremony, and there were 8 groups. Each presented a banner showing what they saw as a sign of hope, because that was the theme of the night. And they spoke about their work. Youth was one, music, sport, justice, medical help, Legion of Mary, married couples, and literacy. The ceremonies got going, and when the Paschal candle was lit, the priest took it over to each of the banners to bless the banner and point out the importance, and then the whole congregation rose to their feet. There was no electric light that night, but they had little candles and the Paschal candle, and they took to the streets of that neighbourhood, which was probably Condovia, I think, and walked through the streets and got back to the church eventually, where Mass continued and finished about 11:30, at which point all the stills were pushed back and the dancing began to go into the small hours of the night. So, and Ursula, who was writing this in the community diary, she said, well, many of the people in that church live lives of rejection, oppression, poverty, and yet through all of this, they have tremendous hope. And if there's one strong word from Padre Gustavo for me, it's this stubborn hope of the Latino person. And she said, this is what I find the most outstanding lesson to be learnt by me as I move among the poor of Lima. And I could probably echo her words there. in one stage, Gustavo wrote that about Cesar Vallejo's poem, I Am Going to Talk About Hope. And he says it expresses the deep, inexpressible suffering of the Latin American poor that also shows the stubborn hope that gives heart to the poor believing people. I think the stubborn hope came from Arguedas originally, but that's just an introduction. I arrived in 1984 and went off to language school. And I think it was while I was at the language school that the letter or the instruction letter came from Rome or something to the bishops, warning them about theology of liberation. But Dorothy got hold of that, and Dorothy read everything about theology, which even was noted in the evening paper in Peru because it was a Catholic country. But when the Salem conference, Santo Domingo, they would tell you each day, today the topic is marriage or divorce or something like that. But Dorothy said even the bishops were divided. And and she wrote, Father Gustavo Gutierrez is such a humble and concerned man. He hears the persecution with patience and trust. And I think his followers did too, more or less. And one thing that was noted was that Karl Rahner, in that very year, wrote a letter to the reigning Cardinal Landazuri in Lima to tell him that he ought to back the writings and the orthodoxy of this theology of Gustavo Gutierrez. And Karl Rahner died within a month of writing that letter. Right. I decided after having various versions of this just to talk about where I worked when I first arrived. Otherwise I was getting too lost in. The parish that our sisters came to looked in the first photograph I saw like the Sahara Desert, actually, that out the window was this big desert, but it was actually an archaeological zone called Huaca Garagai from pre-Columbian times, which apparently were pre-Moses times too, according to that. I had 6 weeks to see a bit of Lima before I went to language school in Bolivia. And when I came home, I just arrived in time for their first mass in the church gathering, because there had been no church, a church down there, but no main church. And there was no roof or chairs, but there were a gathering of people standing around, and there were 10 groups that you could identify by a bamboo pole that the ladies down in the ex-hacienda of Santa Rosa had got hold of. And Dorothy had attached a piece of cardboard with the name of your community. The community, you know, it's like a suburb, but it's a tiny suburb. It's a group of people that live close by and have their own way of organising themselves. And I thought 10 was a lot, because I think when I arrived in Peru, I only heard about 5. But it was the first time that they could meet in the church and then look at one another and say, oh, it belongs to this thing, this parochia that was being built up. That was October 84, and in November 84, I accompanied Dorothy down the road to this ex-hacienda Santa Rosa de Pierola, because the school system had told the headmasters and mistresses, please teach the children what El Papa means or is, or who he is. So the headmistress at Santa Rosa asked Dorothy if she'd do that job, and I went to help her. We met in the chapel in 2 groups, and I just remember the children kept talking about La Virgencita, the little virgin. I thought they meant Our Lady, but I didn't see much of Our Lady, but I saw many little statues and big statues of Santa Rosa. And Santa Rosa, in true Peruvian style, is the saint who looked after them since they were born, and everything, she cared for them. She was the Virgencita. I don't remember how they got to know the Papa. I know up in the mountains it was hard to teach the people about the Papa, because Papa is the same pronunciation for potatoes, which they do know all about. So Christmas came, and in January I was allotted a community to work with which I'm going to call Cerro, C-E-R-R-O, which just means a hill, but it was a semicircular range of hills. If I had you as a class, I'd give you a piece of plasticine, roll like a snake and make a semicircle. That was Cerro. But it enclosed a flat piece of land which had been farming land in a hacienda, but at the time was pretty well a dust bowl. It adjoined a fairly big highway, Gamara, and there were trucks that were parked there and a few houses that were there legally or not. And I counted the houses under my caring concern. I think there were 101 little dwellings, all on the foot of this string of hills, except the ones that went up the skirts of the hill, the faldas of the hills. Yeah. So that was 82. Then we're in 85. That's all I'm doing. 85 February. The Pope came on the 2nd of February. Thousands of religious and priests and holy people went to the main Plaza de Armas, and the paper next morning had a photo of the crowd with two stalks sort of heads sticking up. That was myself and Dorothy. We were above the average height for people in Peru at that stage. Then there were gatherings, a gathering of youth I remember listening to on the radio, thousands and thousands, and the two young ones got up to address the Pope and they said, "Holy Father, we are like sheep without a shepherd." And I thought, gee, that's pretty negative, because the youth in the parish that I saw around the place didn't look too miserable. But it emerged that the address they were to give, which was approved and handed out to the press, was swiftly swapped over by an unnamed bishop who didn't think the other one was good enough. So that was part of the Peruvian church at the time. Then the next day or so, there was a gathering of the poorer people from the young towns, the Pueblos Jóvenes, and the address was made by a couple, Irene and Victor, who were members of the YCW, MTSA, and they said, "Holy Father, we are hungry." And Gustavo puts this in the beginning of his book there. "We suffer affliction, we lack work, we are sick. Our hearts are crushed by suffering, our wives give birth with tuberculosis, etc., etc." But they finished off their first paragraph by saying, "Despite all this, we believe in the God of life." And he quotes that because he called his next book after it. So, and my contact with people belonging to the MTSA would help me greatly in my work, enormously. Mm-hmm. In March of that year, some of us went to Gustavo's talks, nearly 2 weeks of talks. You could go to a workshop at about 3:30 in the afternoon, and then the talk started at something like 5:30. And I was talking to Sister Graciela beside me. She'd come on a bus from Colombia. Someone came from Ecuador, and these had come up from Argentina, because Gustavo giving talks was enough to get people on these terrible overland buses. And his topic that year was experience of God. And he worked from the patriarchs and the prophets right through to modern day Christian communities. Mm-hmm. And it was a special joy for me because I actually saw Gustavo. Not there's a lot of him to see, hasn't got that height from his polio during his growing time. But wonderful, because wonderful Spanish that newly initiated monks could understand too. In April of that year, there were presidential elections in Peru, but that was that. Oh, yes, and they used the Pope had changed his speech after listening to Irene and Victor, and he'd said, "Hunger for God, yes. Hunger for bread, no." So that was used, as Dorothy says, by the bright blue and the bright red ends of politics. We started Catechesis Familiar, which we call CAT-FAM, because too many syllables go like that. And we'd heard about it. Mick Putney had talked about it. It's parents introducing what we call catechetics to their own children. So the parents are asked to go as a couple to a nearby house, 5 or 6 houses up, once a week, and meet other couples, 5 or 6, no more couples, and there'll be a theme. There's a piece of paper folded over with a picture or 2 pictures and a theme. And they discuss it, they talk about it, and then they go home, and the next morning or the next night, mum or dad says, we were talking about such and such. And then the children are asked to go to a children's group at the weekend, and they do songs and games and prayers and things. Yeah. Interesting thing about that catechesis is that number 4 topic says La mujer también vale. That means that women also have their value. Little girls also have their value. And one of the women said to me, when my husband saw that one, he went quiet. And then 20 years later, up in Pitamarca, one of the women sitting outside this 350-year-old church, she said to her friends, because her son heard her, how come they've never told us that before? The catechesis was like the backbone of evangelisation in these new places where people didn't know one another very well, and began to trust the neighbour and talk about their lives. It's wonderful. And we didn't have to do much except help to prepare the guiding couples. The guiding couples met once a week just to talk about the topic and watch the kids. It was people run, and the Peruvian people do that so well. They get on a commission and they grab hold of a topic or a job to do and run with it. In May, the area was working, the chapel was open, the chapel salon it was called, with a big mass and the Holy Cross procession marching down around this dust bowl, that didn't have, the boys played football and the dogs had a wonderful time down there, but it was all empty. But during the Pope's visit, people had occupied the rim of this hill up there. It looked like a dinosaur's back, little up things. And the police didn't bother chasing them with tear gas because later on they built 126 steps up to the top of, they called it John Paul Pilgrim, I think we called it, Juan Pablo. And that was how high it was, and that's how far they had to bring water for many years and anything else they wanted, box of matches and a candle, up 126 steps to get a block of land.
Now, Angela, I'm going to be a very rude host and tell you you've only got about 1 minute left. So if we could bring your thoughts to the end, that would be great. Thank you.
I'll just say then in March 88, Irene McCormack had noted that she also had been greatly helped by Gustavo's book, and she was able to go to his lecture and said she was delighted, and the people were hanging on his every word. 1,500 people, she said. He was greatly loved, and that was that. The other thing from the children's club that I started that year, they celebrated a 30 years anniversary in December because the M83 State Ladies, the YCW group that I knew, took it on when I went to the mountains, and they've kept it going. They've just, and they've got youth running it now. They've just celebrated 30 years on top of the 10 years that I had it. Thank you.
Thanks, Angela. It's terrible to have to squash so many memories and reflections into such a short time, and I'm sorry we need to move on, but thank you so much for those reflections. I'm now going to invite Jorge to speak with us, and Jorge, the question I'd ask you to reflect on is from the perspective of someone from the region with your family background and cultural connections, how has Gustavo's work shaped your own life and influenced the way you have worked?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks, everyone. First of all, I'd really like to say that I'm very much humbled to be in the presence not only of Angela and Michael, but also everyone here who I'm sure, even though I don't know you all individually, have dedicated a lifetime to the sort of social change that I think was very much, or we very much associate with the work of Gustavo and all those who followed his footsteps. For me personally, my journey, or the journey that led me towards Gustavo Gutierrez, and in particular his theology and his what I think of as theoretical writings, started really probably the morning of September 11 in 1973. I was at home as a kid, obviously, but probably really my strongest memories, youthful memories, date back to that time. That morning, the military coup started in outside Santiago, actually in Valparaiso in Chile. Communications were cut off pretty quickly. In our home, like everybody else, we were left to find news through rumor, through one or two radios that hadn't yet been closed down by the military as they moved swiftly. But most importantly, I suppose, like many families, we waited for our fathers to come home. And in my case, I was lucky enough that days later my father did return, unlike really hundreds, thousands of workers who, like him, stayed in their factories, initially at the call of the elected socialist president Salvador Allende, who had initially called on workers to defend their gains. Of course, many of those workers did not return. And in many ways, I suppose that's really the beginning of my journey towards Gustavo Gutierrez as a child, as a kid. From that day onwards, I would be part of many conversations, dinner table conversations, hushed tones, hushed. Sorry, I think I dropped out there. Did I, Paul?
Yes, I think, but we've got you again, which is good news. So please continue. Sorry.
Hopefully it's not my internet.
I panicked.
Many of our conversations, of course, in the first instance, while we were still in Chile, were very hushed dinner table conversations, but they progressed into my teenage years and in our exile here when we arrived in Australia. And all those dinner conversations with my parents very typically ended, as they still do with my father, who will be 80 this year, with, especially if you offered my father a drink of wine or two, they would always end with the same statement: I'm a Christian and I'm a socialist. And as a result of those conversations, very early on in my life, probably in my early teens, I became acquainted with various figures that in many ways prefigured the work, in action maybe, if not in written text, the work of Gustavo Gutierrez. Principally, or first, I suppose, I became acquainted with Camilo Torres, after whom one of my brothers is named, who was a revolutionary Catholic priest in Colombia who actually died in combat at the age of 37. 5 years, if I remember rightly, 5 years before Gustavo Gutierrez would publish Theology of Liberation. He was a member, or had become a member, of the ELN, the Ejército de Liberación Nacional, the National Liberation Army, a guerrilla organization that had been engaged for some time in struggle against the various dictatorial governments in Colombia that dated back decades. So I became very familiar with his work, if not, as I said, as text, certainly his actions. My father would often use one of his phrases: if Jesus was alive today, he'd be a guerrillero, which in Spanish is just a guerrilla fighter. Once I came here to Australia, like most Chileans and Latin Americans, good Catholics or Catholic background, we were supported by the Catholic Church really on a weekly basis in all sorts of ways as refugees, including being put into school. And I went into a secondary school called Villanova Boys College. It's still there in Brisbane, Coorparoo. And when I finished there, I went to theology college that was based at All Hallows in Brisbane. But in many ways, it wasn't really that education or that Catholic education or even the reading I was starting to do around liberation theology that brought me to the work of Gustavo himself. It was actually revolutions themselves, and in particular, the revolution in 1979 in Nicaragua. That revolution came at the end of a cycle, really, of revolutions in the post-war period that went all the way from the Horn of Africa, Southeast Asia, through the Americas, and of course, most famously, the Cuban Revolution. But then in 79, the Nicaraguan Revolution. And one of the figures that I'm sure all of you are aware of that was very centrally known as part of that revolutionary process was Ernesto Cardenal. And he also a Catholic priest and poet who actually for quite a period, if I remember rightly, from 79 to 87, I think, was actually the Minister of Culture under the Sandinista government. He was my first introduction to the more textual, if you like, liberation theology, and through him to Gustavo Gutierrez. And certainly that revolution probably played a particularly big role, the Nicaraguan Revolution, in my own evolution theologically at the time, and certainly politically. Like for Gustavo Gutierrez, for Ernesto Cardenal, in his own words, Christ had led him to Marx. And similarly, I think it was Ernesto Cardenal who led me in a similar direction, and then to Gustavo Gutierrez himself and his work. It's worth noting, of course, that, as you would all be aware, the story of Catholicism in Latin America to this day, and certainly at the time, is not one-sided. And Cardenal was, if I remember rightly, I can't remember when, but he was stopped from administering the sacraments sometime, I think, in the 80s by Pope John Paul II, and only restored, I think, a year before he died in 2019 by Francis. So that, is, I suppose, was typical, especially of the time in the Catholic Church. It's obviously a little bit different now. As time went on and I was more active in political circles, I also became acquainted and actually met, was part of some tours that happened globally of Padre Rafael Maroto. And many of you might not know him, but he was quite an important figure as a Catholic priest in the national leadership of the movement of the revolutionary left in Chile, which was the main armed resistance for a long period against a dictatorship in Chile. And he was on their national executive effectively, and he did a global tour that I was part of, and I was happy and lucky enough to meet him during that period. And he also had quite a big influence on me, and you could see in his writings similar sorts of sentiments that had come through already in the work of Gustavo Gutierrez. Just to quote, he said at one point, "The Christian and the non-Christian, the believer or the atheist who wants to contribute to the construction of the new egalitarian classless society must recognize their place in combat alongside the oppressed." And for me, this was I suppose, what attracted me to Gustavo Gutierrez, and that is his understanding that you cannot avoid taking sides. And to be honest, particularly happy to be given this opportunity to reflect on his work now, because as far as we may seem to be from that time in history, I think that need to take sides, for me, is more relevant than it ever was, probably more relevant than it was even at the time Gustavo was writing about it. On that note, I think it's worth, I wanted to finish my comments by just quoting a piece of Gustavo Gutierrez's work in one of his writings in the book compilation, The Power of the Poor in History. In it, and I think this really sums up this need to take sides and what it means for Christians. He said, But perhaps what most shocks the Christian seeking to take sides frankly and decisively with the poor and exploited and to enter into involvement with the struggles of the proletariat is the conflictual nature of praxis in this context. Politics today involves confrontation and varying degrees of violence among human groups, among social classes with opposing interests. Being an artisan of peace not only does not dispense from presence in these conflicts, it demands that one take part in them in order to pull them up by the roots. There is no peace without justice. This is a hard, uncomfortable truth for those who prefer not to see these conflictual situations or who, if they see them, prefer palliatives to remedies. It is equally hard for those who, with all the goodwill in the world, confuse universal love with a fictitious harmony. But the gospel enjoins us to love our enemies. There is no way not to have enemies. What is important is not to exclude them from our love. In Christian circles, of course, we are not very much accustomed to thinking in conflictual, concrete terms. Instead of antagonism, we prefer a spirit of conciliation. Instead of the provisional, we prefer our evasive eternity. We have to learn to live peace and think peace in the midst of conflict. As I said, I can't think of a more relevant framework for understanding and living in the world today. Thank you.
Jorge, thank you very much for those reflections and bringing us that unique perspective on Gustavo's work. We're now going to Michael Elphick. And Michael, if I could pose the question to you, what does Gustavo's work mean for today, and how can it serve as a lens for our ongoing reflection and action?
Thanks, Paul, and thanks everyone for joining with us tonight. And like Jorge, I feel like a bit of an imposter, particularly in this circle where I'm sure there are people far more confident to speak of the theological framework that Gustavo gifted us with than I am, and who have, like Angela, a deep personal ministry connection to the work of communities in Latin America in particular that were inspired by the spirit of liberation theology. And so thanks, Angela, for that, but also thank you, Jorge, for that connection that you spoke of through your family to what was occurring at the time and your encyclopedic knowledge of all those political movements that were spawned in South America over those years. I feel like the third speaker in a high school debate team who's got to pull it all together now. So I'll do my best. I've got a few thoughts I want to share for you. Then I've got a couple of little, I am by nature and by inclination still a high school teacher. So I have a couple of little clips from a film called Motorcycle Diaries that I'd like to share with you if we can make the technology work. But I think capture a little of the spirit of what Gustavo was about. And I hope they're as meaningful for you as they were for me when I first saw the film. So very quickly, I'll make one comment about Jorge's reference to 1973. I do not have that connection, family connection. My family is, my background is Irish English. I won't bore you with all the details, but the spirit of Ireland, I think, runs deep in me and in many of the friends I have surrounded myself with in life. And even though no personal tragedy has struck me in the way it has struck the family of Jorge, the story of 1973 was one of the first stories that I encountered as an undergraduate at Teachers College that stirred my sense of rebellion and stirred my sense that perhaps all was not well with this great friend we had in the United States. And I remember very much that story and that film Missing as having a very, very primary impact on me. And I can recall someone saying to me, why does this resonate with you so much? And I started just saying that line from Yeats, out of Ireland have we come. Great hatred, little room, maimed us from the start. I carry from my mother's womb a fanatic's heart. So the Irish have always resonated with these stories, and that resonation is a part of my history. Okay, how did I stumble into all this? Well, inclined by nature to be interested in these stories, I started traveling as a young student to India and Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. I did that through Teachers College, and the whole point of it was to encounter the developing world under the leadership of a great Christian brother called Peter Hancock, who's recently passed away. Afterwards, I started traveling to places like with the Edmund Rice Centre to interview refugees who'd failed in their attempt at asylum seeking went to Africa and interviewed them. We were on human rights delegations to Palestine. We went into Gaza and went into West Bank towns falling under apartheid like Hebron and Bethlehem. And then with Oxfam and the Edmund Rice Centre, I went on human rights delegations that took us into El Salvador and Nicaragua and Guatemala. In India, I saw what a breach of someone's economic rights, in terms of human rights. What did we get confronted with in India? It was the poverty of India and the failure to meet the human rights owed to them under their economic and social rights. But walking into Palestine and then later into Latin America, the break in human rights that you're confronted with, while there is poverty there, what I was seeing was a breach of political and civil rights. And these travel experiences and study experiences began to challenge the quite comfortable Catholicism I had as a youth, as a young man, the Catholicism that took me into the seminary, and that now in my 40s, back then, I'm now in my 60s, back then was no longer working for me. It no longer was fit for purpose in terms of helping me apply the good news of Jesus Christ to the kind of world I was seeing in India, Palestine, Gaza, El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala. I couldn't make sense of that world with the Catholicism I had as a boy. So I went looking for something else, and I fell in with Gustavo Gutierrez. And the language and methodology of liberation theology became that framework and methodology for which I was able to put all those experiences back into a context, a Catholic context and a Christian context, and apply the gospel to it again. And well, I'd say it took a decade to do that, And I'm only now becoming full circle, really, and coming back into, I would now call myself a practicing Catholic in the ways I didn't call myself that in my 40s and 50s. And I might say, give tribute to my friends online with me here. Two of the groups that kept the flame of my Catholicism alive during those wilderness years were the Columban missionaries and the Scalabrinians, who kept the grip, the wrist, the hand grip on that I didn't fall away entirely. So what did I learn when I deconstructed that Catholicism? What did Gustavo help me do? He required, as Vatican II required us to do, which was to read the signs of the times and to use all the tools of our intellect provided by anthropology, sociology, psychology, archaeology, to bring that to the service of faith and understanding and to the service of the gospel in coming up with a theology that made sense of a broken world. And that's what I believe liberation theology allowed me to do. Gustavo, for me, was a bit of a gateway drug back into theology, back into a theology of liberation, because I didn't stop with Gustavo. I went looking for other people that wrote like Gustavo. And instead of going simply back to the Latin Americans, I went looking for Asian liberation theologians, and I found three that had a powerful post-Gustavo impact on me. The first was Tissa Balasuriya, an oblate. The second was the Jesuit Aloysius Prius. And the third one was, I believe, a Franciscan, I might be wrong, Peter Pham from Vietnam. And all of them took Gustavo's work and put an Asian face to it. I want to tell you a quick story from Tisabella Surya, and I don't think Gustavo would be too offended if I do this here, that I think captures the spirit of it powerfully for me. I was traveling with a colleague, Wayne Tinsey. Wayne's just retired out of Edmund Rice Education. Some might know him. He and I have always journeyed around the world looking for these people and these experiences. And we found Tisabella Surya in a monastery in outside of Colombo in Sri Lanka. And we had made an appointment with him, and we had told him we wanted to talk about liberation theology. But he forgot we were coming. But we found him anyway, and we turned up and knocked on the monastery door. And when he remembered who we were and what we were coming to do, he looked around over his shoulder and he says, you know, this house is a terrible place to do theology. He said, I'll take you somewhere else. So we walked out on the street and he hailed down a rickshaw. And we all crammed into the back of the auto rickshaw, and Paul knows what I'm talking about, those Indian, Southeast Asian rickshaws we all used to drive around in. And off we went. And I had a suspicion where he was taking us. He took us deep into a slum outside Colombo. And eventually the rickshaw stopped, and we got out of the rickshaw, and he paid the driver, and we walked up through these tiny little streets. You've all been to the developing world, I'm sure, so you can, or seen images of it, and you can picture what these places look like. It took us deep into the slum. The first thing I noticed as we walked into the slum was he was known by name. People called out to him, called him Father Tissa. Young children ran around him. He was well known and much loved. We arrived at this little hut. And we went into the hut. It was a bare cot with just a sheet on it. There was a bowl for washing, and he had a small typewriter on a desk and a copy of the scripture, and that was pretty much all that was there. And a woman came to the window and she handed us some chai, and we had chai and a little plate of biscuits. This whole thing took a good hour and a half to get deep into this slum. And then he simply said to us, this is a better place to do theology. And I don't remember anything else he said to us that afternoon. The whole encounter with Tissa was a parable. He took us on a journey. He just repositioned our thinking. Our best theology is not done from comfortable places. Our best theology is done close to the people for whom that theology must make sense. So he did his theology, his theological writing, inside a slum outside Colombo in Sri Lanka. And as I walked away, remember, Tisabella Surya was under censure from Rome. Pope Benedict was the Cardinal Ratzinger at that point, and he'd been censured, and I'm not sure if he lost his faculties. I think he did. And I wondered as I walked out of the slum with Tissa, how many of the men who had censured him and had criticized him were known by first name in a slum in Southeast Asia. I hope that little vignette speaks to you a little. It spoke very powerfully to Wayne and I really don't remember anything else he said that afternoon, except that little moment where he said, this is where a better place to do theology. So I want to take you to this film. I've got some stuff I could present to you from Aloy Prius, but I won't go there. And I'm very conscious of what time I've got. So I'll go over to this little video, and I want to just remind you that Gustavo first did his theology in Europe. And he did his theology in Europe after World War II. And he speaks about European theology being fascinated or consumed with the question of how did God allow this to happen, particularly in the shadow of the Holocaust? Where was God? The big question of European post-war theology was all about God's absence. When he got back to Peru and he started having those deep encounters with the poor, he said that wasn't the question they were asking. The question they were asking was, how can we be so poor in a land that's so clearly and abundantly rich? They weren't focused on God's absence. They were asking, on whose side is God? So different story. So I just want to show you a little clip from the closing footage of Motorcycle Diaries. I don't know who's seen this, but it's a story of the young Che Guevara. And Che Guevara, if you remember, travels South America prior to his radicalization, before he becomes, the communist and links with Fidel and becomes a revolutionary. He was a medical student and he travels South America, and the experience radicalizes him. I just want to put this little clip on this, which is a great summary of what he saw in Latin America and the kind of experience, I think, or the kind of faces that may have suggested to Gustavo that the European theology we have all inherited, the Eurocentric theology, the theology of privilege, may need to be rethought. I'll put this on the screen for us.
While you're doing that, Michael, you be aware you're down to your last couple of minutes of
Okay, I'll quickly do this and I'll end on this. I'll end on this. I've got to share it first, I think, Paul, don't I? Here we go, my friends. Okay, I've got to put this on the screen. And Paul, you'll tell me if it's coming up. Is it all good? Okay, I'm sorry, I've jumped past the one I wanted to show you, but this will do the point.
I can see it, but I don't think we can hear it yet, Michael.
Okay, I hope the sound comes on. No? All right, I'm going to go back to something else in case the sound doesn't work, Paul. We'll try this one. Can you see that picture of the women? Okay.
Yeah, we can see it.
I'll try for the sound, but the images will do.
Pero ese vagar sin rumbo por nuestra mayúscula América me ha cambiado más de lo que creí. Yo ya no soy yo. Por lo menos no soy el mismo yo interior.
In the film, they're the faces of the people, the downtrodden, the broken, the impoverished that Ernesto and his traveling companion meet on the way. I would think that it's that experiences that radicalized Gustavo, as it radicalized Tissa Bellasuria, Ally Pyrrhus, Leonardo Boff, and all the people that we group into that experience of liberation theology. And to answer the question Paul put to me, what does it mean for us today? It's for us to continue to identify that category of person and stand in solidarity for them. And to look at movements like Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, Me Too, and even might I say, our own Royal Commission into clerical abuse, into sexual abuse of children, as works of the Holy Spirit. Because in liberation terms, they are eruptions of the poor into consciousness, into popular consciousness. They are the unsilencing of the poor and the marginalized. Now, and I have no hesitation declaring the Royal Commission a work of the Holy Spirit, because it has forced us to pay attention to a group of people who have been harmed and hurt and have been silenced It was an eruption of the poor into our consciousness and questioning the very theologies of privilege that we've maintained for a very long time. Have I got 30 seconds, Paul?
If you're lucky.
If I'm lucky, I've got 2 more images I want to use to challenge a little bit. I'm just going to go back here for a second. Is it back on the screen? All right. I am a school teacher, remember. Let me just go over the bell just a little bit. Okay. When I travel around Asia, I like to tease the sisters who give me so much lovely hospitality and ask them why they've still got images like this on their wall. Now, perhaps people in the group might like to think, well, why do we promote these Eurocentric, heteronormative sort of cisgendered images of the Last Supper so commonly around? Why wouldn't something like this perhaps be more appropriate for sisters working in Asia? Which image of the Last Supper would be a liberationist representation of the Last Supper? What would Gustavo perhaps be more open to in terms of depiction? Yeah. Why are we so fixated on thinking of Jesus looking like the image on the left and not like he probably looked the image on the right? And my last promotion of liberation theology is it gives us the tools, I hope, to critique and reject this, which is the product of evangelical Christianity in the United States and is the opposite of the gospel that's promoted by us as Catholics, but also by liberationists. Okay, so good. I'm finished.
Thank you, Michael.
Sorry for rushing, everybody. Sorry for rushing.
It's always a rush. We always overestimate what we can do in such a short period of time.
And I apologise for being an imposter and speaking to all these people who probably know more about it than me.
Well, that's part of the conversation, isn't it, to get the dialogue happening? And
yeah.
Big thanks to Tony Robertson, who's been supplying all the background notes in the chat for some of the sources that Michael was referring to while he was speaking. That's
great.
Very impressive work on the run, Tony.
With no warning.
Yeah, so very good. So we now get to, I guess, one of the highlights of the evening, and with great deal of gratitude to Angela and Jorge and Michael, we now get the opportunity to post some questions, offer some comments, share our own reflections for a little while. You can put questions in the chat if you like. You can use the raise your hand function in Zoom, or if you prefer, you can just unmute yourself and make yourself heard, and I'm sure we'd be very happy to hear from you in the next little while. I see Brian Lucas with a hand up of sorts. So Brian, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. Just very briefly, I still have on my shelf my copy of the Theology of Liberation that I got in my first year in the seminary in 1975. And tonight's discussion prompts me to go and take it off the shelf and reread it. But I wanted to just resonate with what Michael said about where you do theology. I've spent, as you know, 20-something years in the church bureaucracy, dealing with all those people in Rome who haven't been anywhere, until they appointed me to Catholic mission. And some of the most powerful moments have been in places that I never thought I would ever go to. And I just, for reasons that are irrelevant now, I happened today to revisit some stuff I wrote about the bombing, because Sri Lanka prompted me to talk about this, the bombing of the churches in Easter in 2019. And I went to St Anthony's Shrine with my counterpart from the United States, and I still have the picture of the statue of the risen Christ, blood splattered and shrapnel damaged, which they've got in a case. And so that violence, which is still unresolved, is very much part of our world. And I think the challenge to be aware that the living out of the gospel involves the need to confront those sorts of circumstances. So thanks, Michael, for raising that particular image.
Thanks, Brian. Yep.
Other questions and comments? I have one that I'd like to, I see Mel, is it? Would you like to ask a question or comment? Please go ahead. And Greg
yes,
Lopez has a hand up as well.
This is a pretty negative comment. I felt a bit of a strong reaction when it was those pictures were shown about sisters having those sort of very pious pictures on their walls. I don't think that speaks for everybody.
No.
And I felt I just really had a strong reaction to seeing that and be called, this is what sisters have in their convents. Now, I know that in many places there hasn't been a movement towards change and even sort of embracing the local art. But I think I had to say that because I think it felt pretty strong in me.
Yeah.
I have a beautiful, we haven't touched this stuff for a very long time.
Sister, yeah, I'm sorry if that was offensive to anyone. I don't do that bluntly. I'm sorry, yeah. I stand by it though. I challenge them, and I do it once I've established a relationship and a rapport with them. And it was sisters who gave me the second image I should have added. And I don't, and it's ubiquitous, that image, through the church and all through Asia, as are white European representations in parishes and in monasteries and men's houses, women's houses throughout Asia. And it stands to reason. Why are they embracing images like that? And where are the women in those representations of the Last Supper? And I just put that question to them. Where are the women?
Yes.
Where are the women? And see, don't you think it is quite bizarre that, knowing the gospel as the sisters do, with the women so well represented in the gospel, and the first preaching of the resurrection is by women, the women who stood by Jesus, the people who stood by Jesus at the cross were women. Don't you think it's strange that no women were at the Last Supper? We ask why clericalism is so embedded in us. It's because these are the images we put up as pious representation of our stories. So where are the women? Where were the women to adopt a representation of the Last Supper from Leonardo da Vinci from the Middle Ages, from the Sistine Chapel, and say that enters our religious imagination and limits our religious imagination? I think it's a good question. Offensive or not, I've got to tell you, I think it's a good question. Where are the women?
Okay. I might contact you later.
Yeah, let's have a coffee. I'm in Randwick.
Thank you.
Where are the women?
Thank you.
And pick up for the women.
Thank you. I don't think we need to waste any more time.
Yeah, thanks, Mel, and thank you, Michael. And certainly all comments are welcome, and we don't mean to offend anybody's perspective, and certainly
I'm a
there's
lovely
ways
man.
we can. But there are hands up all over the room, so I better get to some. I'm going to go to Greg, and then to Robert, and then to Tony, in that order. So over to you, Greg.
Thank you, Paul. To all the three speakers, if you can elaborate on the term confrontation. From my readings of who Gustavo was, it seems the most humble person. What would confrontation be? I look at Sister Angela. What would confrontation look like to her? And also confrontation in different contexts. How, under a military regime, what would confrontation look like? In a democratic, in a free society, what would confrontation look like? So I would love to hear how the three speakers understand confrontation within liberation theology. Thank you.
Thanks, Greg. Angela, would you like to respond to that in the first instance?
I did get a reaction to it because it's not one of the words that is in my experience or reading of Gustavo's books. I can't say he didn't, I could say I didn't see him anywhere promoting confrontation. I didn't actually see him, what I read, telling the people what to do. I saw him reflecting. He said theology is part two. It's you live with the people you watch and then you go away and you reflect, or you pray and then you reflect. That's theology on what people are doing and what their spirituality is. But I didn't see him imposing, which is not to say that if they said we're going to do a protest, what do you think we should do? I haven't seen experiences of that. But I saw we went to protest, people did protests, but it's different from confrontation, the way I see it. And I didn't feel that was promoted. Greg, I'm sorry, I'm not an expert, but there was a lot of protests and people wanting to offer the government this and they wouldn't accept it, and a bit of anger, but you just got the tear gas or water cannon, that sort of thing. Yeah, but people, I think, go back and think about it.
Jorge, would you like to respond to that?
Sure. It's a very good question, Greg. And in some respects, for me, it goes to the heart, I suppose, of my interpretation. I don't think it's a choice thing. Confrontation comes to the poor, and for that matter, to Christians. It's not something that we choose. It's the choice is, do we take sides in it? And for me, that's very much what Gustavo was about. And different, I think I referred to Rafael Maroto in Chile. He put it a bit more sharply in some of his terminology, as did Cardenal and so forth. But I think you find it certainly in the writings. Well, I mean, the quote that I've got behind me, I chose quite deliberately from Gustavo's work. Take sides frankly and decisively. I mean, if you take sides frankly and decisively, you are involved in a confrontation. I mean, the word confrontation, of course, I mean, confrontation, an argument is a confrontation. It doesn't, obviously, it's not defined necessarily as bloody violence, although, if you're a Christian right now in the West Bank, it probably is defined with bloody violence. So it's, yeah, I think it's not a choice. It's really the only choice is, do we take sides in those confrontations?
Thanks, Jorge. Michael, would you like a quick word on that?
I think Jorge's answered that well. I get to where Greg is going, I think, in his question on another pathway that where I think the limits of Gustavo for me were, and he may well have answered this later in life. I kind of had moved on and read other things. I went down a pathway with the biblical scholars after liberation theology, Marcus Borg, Dominic John Crossan, John Shelby Spon, these people. And I started, the last essay for my master's in theology was an open subject I was able to do with David Ranson, where I wrote a piece called Rethinking the Exodus. And I came to understand the Exodus as a liberation movement, not by the Jews, who we know now weren't around at the time we think the Exodus may have happened, but there was a group around called the A Peru, and they were a political movement. They were poor, bonded laborers in the ancient Near East, common through all those states of the ancient Near East. And they began a revolution in the name of this new God, Yahweh. And there was a religious cadre amongst them. There was the poor, and then there was a military cadre amongst them who sought to win their freedom through violence. They had a name for the project they were engaged in. The name was Promised Land. Jesus inherits that project through the prophets. He gives it a new name. He calls it the Kingdom of God. And he does two significant changes to the project. He says, first of all, it's not about geography. It's about relationships. And the second thing he says is this project cannot be advanced through violence. So confrontation, yes, but not violence. We cannot advance the kingdom of God through violence. But that's a long, quick way around for what was a 15,000 word essay. And I'm happy to share it with you. But that's my conclusion. Confrontation, yes, because the poor are in that conflict and we must stand with them. But we cannot advance the kingdom of God through violence.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Greg, for that question. Over to you, Robert.
Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah,
Yes,
great.
we can.
Thanks very much to all the speakers. Brian Lucas mentioned that he read Theology of Liberation in 1975. I did also. And at the time also, or a bit before then, I'd traveled in India and in Eastern Europe. And I recall, I suppose, quite strongly the pathos of Salvador Allende in Chile, but also of Alexander Dubček in Czechoslovakia. When I was living in Britain later, I went with Chilean refugees to see a film about the Sandinistas. This would have been about 77, 78. Then, of course, they came to power just a few years later. Now we have the tragedy of Daniel Ortega declaring himself president for life, and I think his wife vice president for life. We know that Che Guevara became a member of an oppressive communist government allied with the Soviet Union. So I suppose what strikes me is the pathos of liberation sometimes becoming oppression, and therefore the enormous importance of articulating our desire for liberation, our bond with the poor, articulating that with democratic structures, democratic procedures, as the social democratic movement has attempted to do since the 19th century. And I think Catholic social teaching, although not perfect, is a very good guide to that. How do we articulate our passionate desire for liberation of the poor with respect for democratic structures so we don't end up with people like Ortega claiming to be president for life and so on? Thank you.
Thanks, Robert. Did you want any of the panelists to try and respond to that?
Well, they're most welcome if they
No,
wish.
I think it stands. It's a pretty good. Thanks, Robert, for that. You're right. Che Guevara. I mean, he and Fidel end up torturing homosexual men on the streets of Havana. I mean, it deteriorates within a generation, doesn't it? So, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Robert, and thanks for that, Michael. Let's go to Tony for your question or comment.
Very good.
Thanks so much. This has been really inspiring, and people are talking about their memories.
Tony, you're a bit quiet. Could you get a bit closer to your mic or something? And those of us who are hard of hearing.
Okay, how's that? Good. Okay. A person who wears hearing aids, I tend not to shout, but when I'm invited to shout, I willingly comply. So lots of memories. I look at someone like Angela, and I lived in community in Collingwood with Joanna de Bont, who also went to Peru. And as I hear the names like Tisabel Suria, and I was lucky enough to sit at his feet at a Cardine gathering many years ago. And also, I'm thinking more as I hear people talk about the poetry of Cardinal and our use of art as inspiration for a new theology. On the wall in front of me, my crucifix is from El Salvador, and the Christ figure is wrapped in an AIDS ribbon. So art, poetry, etc. When I was in the Philippines in 1980, I had the privilege of spending time with Ed de la Torre, who was in prison for his work in liberation theology. And Ed, again, wrote a lot of poetry. I'd be interested to hear from the speakers about, the impact of art. We talk a lot about theological constructs, etc. But how do we, and I suppose this goes back to Michael's stuff a bit too, how do we introduce people to art, poetry, etc., that takes them into this new way of relating with the most vulnerable in our community? Would anyone like to respond to that?
Thanks, Tony. Anybody like to take on that one?
When I'm working now anywhere, and I want to put up images of the, I reference Mary a lot in my work in safeguarding, for all sorts of reasons I can go into another time. But if I want to use an image of Mary, I steer clear of the sanitized My Way to God textbook sort of images that might flood the internet. I use icons. I just post up the great icons, as I do if I want to reference Trinity or mention wedding at Cana or anything like that. I particularly steer away from what I think are Europeanized imageries. I put up the icons, which I think are, for me, sound the kind of windows. But other than that, I'm not an artist, and I can't help you. But that's what I do. I try to use the ancient iconic icons rather than.
I think we might need to move on and leave it at quite a brief answer to that question,
no
Tony,
idea.
if that's all right, because our
Nothing
time
else.
is almost gone.
Sorry, Tony.
I do have one more question in the chat, and I'd like to just throw that one in if I can as our concluding question, and we'll wrap up in a couple of minutes. So this is a question to Angela, wondering if you could say a little more about the catechetical evangelization method. Was this the basic Christian community that apparently liberation theology promoted or piggybacked on? So would you say a little bit about that, Angela?
I'm just not sure if I'm muted.
You're right. We can hear you now, so fire away.
Program came from Chile, I understand. I don't know if it came with the Bishop Herman Schmidt or not, but he was an expert on it. It would lead to, I'd say it did lead to basic Christian communities, but we didn't put them up as sort of big, because people talking to their neighbours, especially when I can get up to the invasions, but we got invasions in 1985, the night of the president's thing. People came with their square of woven bamboo and invaded. They just made them into a little hoop like that and sat there. And so my area got 1,000 overnight, and it meant there were people from the jungle, there were people from the coast, people from south. And that was very different, because in the Sierra, you're living with your neighbours and you're probably related to a lot of them. But this, having people we don't know and can we trust them, it was a whole new area. So as a technique for people to form communities, sociologically, it was the whole thing of people getting to know, dialoguing, talking about it, sharing, made wonderful communities. People nearly all Catholic. They were in Peru at that time, so they were Christian communities. And the topics in the catechetics, they were the first. I know one of the first ones was parents don't anger your children, or something. Don't draw them to anger. It was a very simple thing. I mean, it wouldn't be simple to talk about, but I mean, it wasn't a whole 3 paragraphs from the gospel or the epistles. So I don't know that I'm answering that question there, but I don't picture parents sitting the children down and saying, now I'm going to tell you everything that was said last night. It wasn't like that. I don't think it was meant to be like that. But that the truth of God, or the relationship with God, our relationship as a family, that would come within the family rather than sister said, something like that.
Thank you for that, Angela. And I'm afraid that at this time we're going to have to wrap up and call it quits for the night. Before we do, though, on your behalf, I'd like to say a very warm thanks to Angela, to Jorge, and to Michael for their wonderful reflections, which has given us such a great insight to Gustavo's life and work over the decades. And so we're very grateful to the 3 of you for your reflections tonight. Thank you for supporting our work. And for everyone who's joined us for our gathering this evening, thank you very much for doing so. We look forward to seeing you again at another Australian Card Eye Institute webinar. We'll expect to have another one in March, so look out for the information. Now that we have your name, we'll make sure that we're in touch with you. So thank you, everyone, and have a safe evening.